does take first order representations as sufficient for having a conscious sensation, a conscious experience, it's recurrent processing theory, which is a theory that I developed myself, partly, by the way, inspired by the distinction that Ned Block, a philosopher, made between what's called phenomenal and access consciousness. Basic idea, but of course I will explain it a little bit more detail further on, is that you have if you look at how visual processing works in the brain, you have a so-called feed-forward sweep, where information goes from low-level areas to higher-level areas, even up to frontal regions and what have you. But that all this feed-forward activation of the brain is unconscious, and that as soon as you get recurrent interactions between, say, visual areas, you get a conscious visual percept, or if it would be auditory areas, you get a conscious auditory percept, etc. And once you get this more widespread activation, including frontal regions, which global workspace theory would call global ignition, well, you get a different type of consciousness, which is this access consciousness, which is more about knowing that you see. In that sense, it also links a bit to these higher order thought theories, but that the knowing of you see is something else than the seeing itself, for which these, in the case of seeing, recurrent interactions between visual cortex themselves are sufficient. These give you phenomenal consciousness, as it's called, and this gives you access consciousness. Actually, the theory didn't really start as a theory, actually started as a set of empirical observations. What was it, 30 years ago by now? I did these kinds of experiments where I was just wondering about this issue of perceptual organization, so we know that in all these different visual areas, you get all these different features extracted, like orientation and motion and color and what have you. So I was wondering, how does all this get integrated into a coherent visual percept that you have of the outside world? So we know we have 30, 40 different visual areas, all doing their thing with visual information. But how does this get integrated into the one percept that you have? So that actually was the question I was after. By origin, I'm a vision scientist in that sense, not even a consciousness scientist. So this is one of the experiments I did there. So I recorded from cells in primary visual cortex of monkeys, and as you know, these cells have very small receptive fields. So this would be, for example, such a small receptive field. And then I would present these kinds of stimuli to these animals. By the way, these were awake animals trained to maintain fixation and also respond to these stimuli, but that's not relevant for now. So small receptive field, and as you can see, within the receptive field, I presented these line segments, which are the same over there, the exact same stimulus within the receptive field. But of course, the more global context of these line segments is fairly different in the sense that, in this case, these line segments belong to such a circumscribed figure overlying a background. In this case, these very same line segments belong to such a homogeneous background without the figure. And then this is what you get, which is that from 40 to 100 milliseconds on, you see that the responses to these two situations of such neurons in primary visual cortex is exactly the same. Which you would expect, given that these cells have these small receptive fields. So cells indeed only look at what happens within the receptive field. And that being identical response is also perfectly overlapping. But then after 100 milliseconds, you will see that there's a clear divergence of the activity of the cell, in the sense that the situation where the figure is the context of these line segments, you get a much stronger response than when it's only background. And this is the difference between the two. And this is then what we call contextual modulation. Contextual modulation because the activity of the cell is modulated by the context, the perceptual context of the scene as a whole. We also observed that, for example, this modulation really reflected the figure-ground organization that you perceive in a scene like this. So, for example, what we recorded from multiple sides along this line, which is crossing because the line was not visible in the stimulus, but with the line, this virtual line which was crossing these the figure, and you can see that as soon as the receptive field is within the figure region, you get this elevated response, and as soon as it's outside, you can see that the response goes back to background level. So it's really as if the activity of the neurons which are representing the figure is sort of elevated relative to the background. Actually, very much like how you perceive it, of course. This is another example of that same finding. And so he did these different receptive fields in different positions relative to the figure, or actually the figure changes position because of course you record from the same neurons all the time. And then you can see this modulation only being there for the figure region. This is a different way of representing the same thing. And so this is where stimulus starts and this is where it ends. And you see this, well, elevation of response. So that suggested that this activation you see in primary visual cortex indeed is reflecting the more global context of the perceptual context of these stimuli. And of course also that these cells at some point, well, from somewhere get information from beyond their own receptive fields. We also probed to what extent this was the perceptual context was really perceptual in the sense that you see this activity really reflecting, for example, figure ground organization also in more complex scenes. So this is an example of such an experiment. Comparing mode versus frame stimuli. So what we did there was with the 3D goggles, we had the animals view these kinds of scenes, but then because of the disparity, they either perceived this frame, as we called it, seeing hovering in front of the background. So of course you see it in 3D here, but it's or sort of a 2D picture, but it's sort of a 3D representation. Because the monkey's looking from this side. So what he actually sees is this background with a frame sort of hovering in front of it, and then we contrasted that with the situation where again because of the 3D disparity in the display, a mode could be observed, like shown here, and then of course there's this sort of island of figure floating in between, and then if you record from neurons here in the center of the stimulus, of course in this case these neurons would then represent a figure again. That's the perceptual interpretation you have. But in this case, these very same neurons, of course, would sit over there, representing the background. And indeed, if you look at the neural signals then, is that in the mode situation, you get this modulation again, the figure ground elevation, which you don't get for the frame situation. So even in complex scenes like this contextual modulation is really reflecting the perceptual interpretation that you have of these kinds of stimuli, even these kinds of complex stimuli. Now, as I said, there's somehow these neurons must get this information from wherever. And of course, the most likely suspect would be that it comes from feedback from higher level regions back to lower level regions. Now, mind you, back in those days, yeah, this is grandpa telling a story, but back in those days, there was very little knowledge about what these feedback connections, which were known to be there from anatomical studies, what they actually did. There was a lot of work studying receptive field properties and feed-forward activation, but what these feedback connections, and by the way also horizontal connections, so connections connecting cells within the same visual region, what these were actually doing. But this turned out to be one of the things they are doing. And so, because if we lesioned extrastriate areas, so regions beyond primary visual cortex, indeed you could selectively get rid of this elevation of the response for the center of the figure. By the way, the response to the boundary between figure and ground still remained. One of the ideas is that this is not so much mediated by the feedback, but more by these lateral connections between cells. Right, so this gave a function to these horizontal and feedback connections, being that they provide these cells with what's called contextual information about what they are doing. So these cells in primary visual cortex, of course, they're looking through a tiny hole, which is a receptive field, but at some point they get information from the rest of the brain about what the actual perceptual context is of what they are doing. Well, hence the name contextual modulation. So what this was telling us is that, well, perceptual organization apparently works a bit like this. So at first you have these feed-forward activation of primary visual cortical neurons where, well, you have all these separate receptive fields which are doing a thing, detecting features in that region of the visual scene. For example, orientation, but we know that, or for example, also direction of motion and disparity and color and stuff like that is detected as well. And then this information is fed forward to other parts of the brain, in parietal and temporal lobe, extrastriate regions, and you have larger receptive fields which may detect there is something like a, well, shape over there or other higher level selectivities. And then this information is fed back to the lower regions, so that you get a fully integrated percept of, you know, what is out there, what the context is of these different orientations, and how this yields things like figure ground organization, but probably also perceptual organization in general. So idea being is that this is how perceptual organization works, how you go from this distributed organization, this distributed representation of all these different elements of a visual scene, towards the more global percept that we have, being that all the different features are detected by all these different neurons, and lower level neurons, higher level neurons in the visual brain. And then by means of horizontal connections and feedback connections, these all get integrated into a coherent whole, which is the percept that we then get. Now, how that works exactly is, of course, well, still to be figured out, but that's sort of the general idea of how perceptual organization works in the visual brain. Now, and of course, this has nothing to do yet with whether this has anything to do with conscious or unconscious. But what we observed next was that indeed there seemed to be something going on there also within the context of consciousness. For example, when we remember what I told you, we made these observations, recordings in awake monkeys. When we anesthetized the animals and recorded from the very same electrodes, because this was all recordings with implanted electrodes, we observed that these neurons still responded to the elements within the scene. So this is, this is stimulus onset, and then you have again 500 milliseconds after stimulus onset. You can see that still clearly a response to all the elements, whether they're on ground or on figure. Remember, this is the same thing as I showed you over there. So different receptive fields and different positions of figures, both for the oriented texture, which is the stimulus I just showed, but we also use the structure for motion stimuli. What that is that basically what you have is that you have a set of random dots, and then one tiny piece of those random dots move in a different direction. So then you very vividly get again this figure ground percept from it. So these two stimuli indeed give you these contextual modulations in the awake condition, but they're completely gone when the animal is anesthetized. Well, the neurons still respond to these moving dots or these oriented, oriented line segments. So that already hinted to something special going on there, in the sense that these feedback connections and horizontal connections apparently are way more susceptible to anesthesia than these feed-forward connections. So then we started looking to what extent this distinction between feedback and feed-forward activation also relates to this conscious-unconscious dichotomy in the awake situation. So this is an experiment where we did backward masking, which of course makes stimuli invisible, a bit depending on the stimulus onset asynchrony between the stimulus and the mask. So what you have here is the behavioral response of monkeys having to indicate via making an eye movement whether they saw such a figure ground stimulus or not. And as you can see, when you present such a figure ground stimulus, which is then masked by another stimulus which also contains these line segments but now figures all over the place, what you get is that up to an SOA of 3 monitor frames. This was in the old days of CRT monitors, so the monitor frame being 16.6 milliseconds, so this is about 50 milliseconds. Monkeys have no way of knowing where the figure ground stimulus sits. They're just at chance level. That's the behavior you have here. This is the graph of the behavior, detection behavior, chance level being 0.5. And the contextual modulation that you can then record from elicited by these figure ground stimulus very nicely matches the visibility, the percept that these monkeys have of the figure ground stimulus. So these bars are the strength of the difference in signal between figure and ground stimulus again. As you can see, there is modulation for all these higher SOAs, but not for the lower SOA. So that also generated an idea about how masking actually works. Because, of course, backward masking, in a sense, is a bit mysterious. I mean, you present a visual stimulus, and then somewhat later you present another one. In this case, 50 milliseconds later, you present another one. Why would that interfere with the percept you have of the first one? Given that, if it would all be feed-forward hierarchical processing, why would a visual stimulus that's presented now be abolished by a stimulus that you present later? Of course, that can only happen if somehow this later stimulus can sort of catch up, which normally, of course, it can't do because, it just enters later. But if you include the idea that there's feedback connections necessary for the visual percept to occur, then you can suddenly understand it, and that's what's depicted here. So the idea being, you present a stimulus, which is then represented in primary visual cortex and then fed forward to higher regions, which of course then also happens because the mask, of course, cannot catch up with the feed-forward activation. But of course, at the moment that these higher regions then want to reach back to primary visual cortex to, initiate these recurrent interactions, which normally induce perceptual organization, of course they cannot do that anymore, at least not in a meaningful way, because now, of course, the information that's now in primary visual cortex is about the mask and no longer about the stimulus. And that's why you don't get perceptual organization, you don't get integration, you don't get contextual modulation for that first stimulus, and apparently, as a result of that, you don't get any conscious perception, you don't get any perception, or at least you don't get any detection in the case of these animals of that stimulus. Even though the information of the stimulus has traveled forward to, say, higher visual areas, and maybe even motor cortex or what have you. And so masking in that sense is sort of a mismatch between feed-forward activation and feedback activation. But okay, so that's another observation. We also used paradigms where we really wanted to pit the difference between seeing and just reacting to a particular stimulus. And here we employed that same paradigm that I also told about when I talked about blindsight in the previous talk, where we had monkeys making saccadic eye movements to stimuli like these, but also introduced catch trials where there was no stimulus at all. And the monkeys were trained in those trials to maintain fixation to also get a reward. So normally when there would be a figure like this, and it could be in 3 different locations, when there would be a figure, they had to make an eye movement to it and then get a reward if they made that in time. But when there was a catch trial, so when there was no figure, they learned, okay, now I have to maintain fixation, indicating, well, there was no stimulus here. I didn't see anything there. So what then happened is that, of course, on most of the trials where there was a figure, they made an eye movement. And on most of the trials where there was no figure, they maintained fixation. But what also happened was that on some trials, some of these figure-present trials, they maintained fixation, as if saying to us, oh, no, I didn't see a stimulus here. Which you can sort of imagine that you every now and then miss such a thing like this. It's not all that conspicuous. So they occasionally missed seeing these. And then we looked at the neural activity. So this is what you have here. you got these contextual modulation signals, so the feedback-related signals, in the cases where monkeys indicating seeing the figure by making an eye movement to it, like shown here. So these are all the red endpoints of the saccadic eye movements they made. But on some of them, as I said, they maintained fixation. This is the green eye movements. And then there was no modulation whatsoever, as if the monkey was sort of anesthetized at that moment. By the way, this is showing you that also there were some trials where monkeys were just all over the place. Yeah, well, that happens, of course, as well. The important thing being this, that the eye movements they made towards the figures usually were, well, not usually, always were beyond 240 milliseconds, which is a bit late actually for merely reflective eye movements. So these were really eye movements which happened after, well, you could say some consideration or something. But anyhow, so all this activation that you see before 240 milliseconds is indeed preceding the eye movement. So it's not the eye movement itself which is causing it. Anyhow, so this seen versus not seen gave you the same idea that this feed-forward activation, which is there regardless of seen or not seen, is always there. It's just the recurrent interactions which are selectively absent in the case of not seen. We also did similar experiments in human subjects. In this case, using dichoptic masking, as it's called. So here we have face stimuli. I don't know whether you can see them, but this is a face. Yeah? So with two eyes here and a smiling mouth there and a sort of a nosy. But of course, this is made out of these texture elements. And this is done representing left eye and the right eye with different kinds of stimuli, in both of which you can indeed see a face as well. But if you combine them there, you get these crosses. Again, if you fuse the left and right eye, so this is not binocular rivalry, but this is binocular fusion. If you fuse them, you see these face stimuli as well. But of course, you can also design the line segment such that if you now have, again, a face in one eye and a face in the other eye, but if you now fuse them, you get all these crosses in which no face is visible. And then you can ask subjects, did you see a face? By the way, we also did this with houses and nonsense objects. But ask them whether they saw the face or the house, etc. And then you really verify that they're really either not seeing anything or seeing in the fuse case, see the face of the house. And then, of course, obvious thing, of course, when you know stimuli are faces and houses, you can look at activity in these face selective and house selective regions. And this is what you get from face selective regions, which is that the FFA, so these fusiform face area, indeed signaled the presence of a face, regardless of whether it was visible or not. So both in this fused version and the invisible fused version, FFA, and so these are the two conditions, FFA selectively responded differently to faces than to houses and nonsense objects, and more strongly to faces than to houses and nonsense objects. So your FFA is indicating to you, well, there's a face out there, which is of course only present in either of the two eyes alone, but not in the fused percept. There's a face out there, regardless of whether you see it or not. So indeed indicating again that feed-forward category information is still present for these invisible faces. And of course that begs the question then, okay, what's the difference then between you seeing the face or not seeing the face in terms of activity in visual cortex? Well, the difference is, well, for one thing, for example, shown here, this is EEG signals. As you can see, both the visible and invisible faces evoke this brief blip of activation at something like 100 milliseconds. But the visible face evokes much stronger activation beyond that 100 milliseconds, which is very comparable to what we saw in the monkeys. And what you also see is that the difference between invisible and visible is that there are way more high and medium frequency oscillations in the case of the visibility. But I think the most direct evidence of this being due to differences in recurrent interactions is when you look at the what's called functional connectivity analysis of the fMRI signals. What that basically does is measure to what extent activity in one region depends on activity in another region. And then what you have here is to what extent activity in early visual areas shown there depends on activation in high-level areas, in this case FFA. Indeed, what you get there is that there is strong connectivity between FFA and lower visual areas in the case of a visible face, which is not there in the case of an invisible face. So again, pointing to the same thing, which is that these recurrent interactions are very strongly linked to, well, whether you see stuff or not. There are a few advantages, you could say, of taking this fundamental divide between feed-forward and recurrent processing as the fundamental divide between conscious and unconscious processing. For one thing, it gives consciousness a clearly separate ontological status from attention. Now, of course, attention is, I would say, the major confound usually in all sorts of research and theories and ideas, and also even folk psychology ideas about what consciousness actually is. Attention being, of course, very confounded with the notion of, okay, I attend to something, therefore I see it, therefore I have a conscious experience of it. And actually, of course, global workspace is, well, sort of equating consciousness with attention. But by taking it like this, so the difference between feed-forward and recurrent processing being the difference between conscious and unconscious, automatically also implies that consciousness becomes orthogonal to this to the phenomenon of attention. Because in this, well, you could say, definition of how things work, attention is merely seen as, well, depth of processing. So both in the feed-forward sense and in the recurrent sense, you have either shallow or deep processing. So shallow feed-forward processing would be processing which is limited to, say, visual areas and stuff. Deep feed-forward processing would be feed-forward processing that proceeds all the way to frontal, parietal, motor regions. And we know that this only happens when indeed you attend to the location where that visual stimulus is presented, even though you may not consciously perceive it. But if you attend to that stimulus, it may proceed all the way up to these frontal regions. If you don't do that, you attend to another location, usually the processing stays way more shallow. And of course, the same holds for recurrent processing. If you attend to a particular stimulus, then of course this will make recurrent interactions grow more widespread and cause global ignition, enables you to give a report, to have a reportable conscious percept, engage frontal parietal regions, which typically doesn't happen when you don't attend to a visual stimulus. Then the recurrent interactions typically stay limited to visual regions. So in that sense, in this definition of consciousness, attention on the one hand and consciousness on the other hand are really orthogonal principles, orthogonal aspects of visual processing. By the way, same holds for things like, for example, cognitive control. Of course, that's a very widespread phenomenon, meaning lots of different things, but it's like more cognitive control, of course, being that you are able to do something with the visual information that you get. Of course, this doing something with visual information, again, depends on activation of more frontal regions and motor regions, premotor regions, which is, of course, also, more a matter of whether something reaches frontal regions than of whether something is feed-forward or recurrent. I mean, if you get frontal regions being activated unconsciously, you still get aspects of conscious control. So I'll show you in a minute. And of course you get conscious control of visual information. If you get this global ignition, frontal-parietal activation in a recurrent sense. And by the way, attention being depth of processing also makes understanding what attention actually is way more easy. Attention basically, if you say, well, attention is basically how deep a visual stimulus penetrates towards frontal regions. Yeah, well, that matters, of course, to what extent there is a biased state. So, for example, when there is some pre-activation in a particular parts of the brain, of course, this particular stimulus can then more easily travel towards these regions than when this is not the case. And of course, there's also like hardwired pathways that visual stimuli may more easily take. For example, we know that faces, or your own name, stimuli like that, socially very relevant stimuli, also have the tendency to get processed more deeply, more automatically, without the need for top-down attention or top-down control, simply because you have these very hardwired, dedicated pathways for processing faces, for processing stimuli like your own name and stuff like that. So there's different predictions from this idea. So that attention goes along this axis, consciousness goes along this axis. Two different predictions, the one being a bit more simple to deal with than the other one. But let's have a look at these predictions. One of the predictions indeed being that there is deep feed-forward processing reaching these frontal parts of the brain and activating these high-level cognitive functions without you having conscious experience of the stimuli evoking these functions. Now, this is an experiment showing you that this prediction indeed holds water. This is an experiment done by Simon van Gaal, where he showed so-called unconscious frontal no-go inhibition. Now, what's no-go inhibition? That's the ability you have to withhold the response to a particular stimulus when you're given an instruction to do that, and otherwise, respond as fast as possible to that stimulus. So this is the stimulus that subjects have to respond to as fast as possible. So they're shown this circle or annulus, and then push a button as fast as possible. But this can then be preceded by either a no-go cue or a go cue. And when it's preceded by a no-go cue, they know, oh, now I don't have to respond to this annulus. And when it's preceded by a go cue, they know they have to respond to the stimulus. Now, there's two varieties in which way this cue is presented. Either consciously, because the cue is shown for quite a while, 230 milliseconds, and the annulus fairly briefly. So you can clearly see this one, and you can also clearly see this one, because this one isn't followed by a mask. So you know what to do there. Don't push there, push there. In this case, however, there is what's called meta-contrast masking of these cues, because here it's shown for 16.7 milliseconds, and then there's a blank interval, and then the go annulus is shown for 200 milliseconds, and this typically yields what's called meta-contrast masking, in the sense that you no longer perceive this square or this triangle, because also the edges and the corners of these squares and triangles nicely fit into these contours of the annulus. And indeed, if you ask subjects whether they can do a forced choice discrimination between this one and this one, they will be at chance level. Now, of course, the question then is, even though this no-go stimulus and go stimulus here are unconscious, not perceived, does this still activate these frontal regions that normally get activated by these no-go stimuli, or not? Well, for one thing, what you get is that indeed, even though in this case these unconscious no-go cues are not perceived, you will still see that there's a difference between this situation and this situation, in the sense that response latencies to this go annulus are longer for the no-go trials than for the go trials. So there is some sort of inhibition making the responses to these go annuli slower. And this is the distribution. Now, of course, then the question is, does this come because there is indeed activation of frontal regions? And I already showed you this a bit. Indeed, the masked no-go stimuli activate regions in inferior frontal gyrus that normally get activated when you have this conscious no-go inhibition, albeit at a somewhat weaker level. And the weaker level, of course, makes it that you don't fully stop your response to the go annulus, but nevertheless you get this slowing of responses to the go annulus, sort of a half-baked inhibition, you could say. And indeed, the amount of activation you see for different subjects in this frontal region, in these frontal regions, correlates with the reaction time slowing. That's more largely shown here. So it's unconscious activation of these frontal regions, and this unconscious activation is also functional in the sense that the stronger the activation, the more slowing down you get. And it was shown that it also happens with more flexible stimulus-response association, so that every trial there is a difference between whether the square is a no-go cue or the diamond is a no-go cue, so same result basically. Don't have to spend too much detail on this. And there are very many other studies showing pretty much the same thing, which is that you can get these high-level prefrontal, typically prefrontal activations and cognitive functions being executed despite the stimulus activating these functions is not consciously perceived. So this is just some experiments showing different things like unconsciously triggered task set preparation, conflict detection, noticing response errors, violation of expectancies, all sorts of different functions that typically are associated with prefrontal functions, which may happen unconsciously when stimuli that evoke these functions are masked. So implicating that there are conscious and unconscious versions of about every cognitive function imaginable. Again, strongly arguing for this orthogonality of, in this case, consciousness and cognition. Now, of course, there are differences between the conscious and unconscious versions. For one thing, they're usually stronger, but there's also, when you want to integrate different cognitive functions, this typically requires a more conscious version of them. So this means that this fast feed-forward sweep, as it's called, and this is another depiction of it, how that works in monkeys. These are the different latencies of when you find the earliest responses to visual stimuli in different parts of the brain. And as you can see, it's called fast feed-forward sweep because it's really, well, pretty fast. From 40 milliseconds on, you get activation in primary visual cortex, and then it proceeds very rapidly through the whole brain. Activation of frontal regions already 25 milliseconds later, motor cortex, etc., some 40 milliseconds after that. So that's why it's called fast feed-forward sweeps, really mediated by feed-forward connections, because, if it goes this fast, there's no way horizontal or feedback connections can get involved. The difference between this and this, 10 milliseconds, is only one spike of an action potential of a neuron. So no way this can be done by horizontal or feedback connections. Has to be all feed-forward connections. But this is typically a fully unconscious process, even though it reaches all the way up to prefrontal regions. And may even activate cognitive functions that these prefrontal or motor regions usually provide. By the way, of course, this also shows you that the frontal activation in itself, apparently, is not sufficient for any conscious sensation or experience, which is already, you could say, slightly problematic for these higher order thought theories, maybe even global neuronal workspace theory. But I think in particular for higher order thought theories, because higher order thought theories, of course, don't require interactions to give you global ignition and more widespread recurrent interactions like global workspace predicts. Higher order thought theory just states when there is a second order representation or a first order representation, which you could argue these feed-forward activations of frontal regions actually do. Well, then there should be consciousness, but apparently there's not. Now let's get into the second prediction of recurrent processing theory, or more specifically this orthogonalization of consciousness and cognition and consciousness and attention, which is that there then should be conscious experience without cognition, at least without attention, but then also, of course, without this access and report that typically this widespread activation will get you. What do I mean exactly? Well, look at the situation. So where you have recurrent interactions between visual cortical areas, but without this frontal involvement. And of course, the frontal involvement is typically what happens when you attend to stimuli, but the frontal involvement also gives you access and reportability. And of course, that's not happening here. So, but you should envision this as something like conscious percepts being there, well, basically without you knowing it, or without you having conscious access to it, without you having any cognition to it. So basically arguing for the existence of conscious percepts, vision, without knowing. And that may sound a bit counterintuitive, or maybe even highly problematic for this theory. So let's get into that a little bit more. Now, of course, there have been these studies that I already showed you about, indeed abolishing this report component of the neural quality of consciousness, these no report paradigms, which indeed argue for this difference between report and conscious perception. So here the nice optokinetic nystagmus experiment, here these no report paradigms showing that P3B is about report, not about seeing the stimulus itself. But of course, the key element, I would say, of recurrent processing theory is, of course, that indeed there is something like this happening. You have these precursors of neurocorrelates, so your eyes, feed-forward processing, for example, would fall into this category. Then you have these recurrent interactions in visual cortex, which are giving you the conscious experience. And then every more widespread interactions involving prefrontal regions are only consequences of the neural correlate of consciousness. But of course, this runs into the problem that if you can have a conscious experience without these consequences, so without this ability to report following, and then you will report the stimulus as being not perceived, as unaware. Well, in fact, the theory sort of dictates that you actually had a conscious experience. So how should we deal with that? And what would be an argument in favor of such a, well, I would say intuitively weird idea? A different way of putting it would be the following. Now, let's discuss change blindness and inattentional blindness. In inattentional blindness experiments, of course, you have this phenomenon that you look at these people playing basketball or whatever, and then there's this gorilla passing by, and because there's no attention of it, you afterwards don't remember the gorilla and report, no, I didn't see a gorilla. But what actually this idea, this recurrent processing theory idea predicts, implies, is that you actually had a conscious experience of a gorilla. Maybe not of a gorilla in the conceptual sense, like, knowing that it's an animal that usually lives in the forest and stuff, but let's say a dark figure or something walking through the scene. So you had that phenomenal experience of this thing walking through the scene, but not at a very high conceptual level, just a mere visual experience of that gorilla. And then if you're asked afterwards, did you see that gorilla? Well, because it was just a fleeting visual experience, a fragile visual experience, well, afterwards you forgot about having this, and that's why you don't report it. So that's sort of the interpretation that recurrent processing theory would make of these inattentional blindness phenomena. Now, with the change blindness phenomena, it's sort of the same. There the idea is, for example, when we look at the guy standing behind the desk, and he ducks down behind the counter, and there's a new guy standing up, and you don't notice the change. The idea, and then of course afterwards, if you're asked, did you notice the change? Many people will say, no, didn't notice. The idea there is that at the moment you were looking at that first guy, you had a phenomenal experience of that guy, and saw that it was a guy and that it was, a person. There was no black hole there or nothing. But then of course, if he ducks down behind the counter, that information, and then a new person is standing up, the old information, the old visual representation, you could say, this first order representation, gets wiped out, and then there's this new figure standing there, and there's this new figure standing there, and now you have a phenomenal representation, a phenomenal percept, phenomenal consciousness of that person, without you realizing that it is a different one from the first one. So it really argues for conscious visual perception being very fleeting and fragile, and just being about what you're seeing now, and also about seeing in a very non-conceptual sense. And so, for example, not really realizing that, for example, a gorilla shouldn't be there in a field of people playing basketball. But nevertheless, conscious vision, nonetheless. So even though it's non-conceptual and not memorized and stuff, it's still a visual percept, a conscious visual percept. And then it's no surprise that afterwards you report, well, no, I didn't see that. Some have argued that theorizing about the possibility of conscious experience without attention access and report as recurrent processing theory does, of course, is scientifically unverifiable. Because how will it ever be possible to know that someone, or even yourself, has a conscious experience when he's not allowed or not possible to attend to the experience and then hence access it, have cognitive reflections on it, and ultimately report it. And therefore, yeah, well, if that's impossible, it's sort of a black box which you cannot experimentally verify. That's not entirely true, because there are falsifiable elements, of course, in this theory, in recurrent processing theory. So if we take these reports as well, indeed being the verification of global ignition and involvement of attention, access, and report regions, of course, it's entirely possible that without attention, access, and report, without attention in particular, there's no such thing as recurrent interactions between visual areas. It could entirely be that you need attention for these recurrent interactions to occur, or maybe that you even need attention for feature extraction, or maybe even categorization of stimuli like face selectivity, etc. So that's a purely experimental question, of course. How do these purely visual operations that are supposed to happen here, independent of attention, access, and report, for one thing, of course, how are they mapped on feed forward and feedback, but of course also how do these depend on attention? So let's have a look at those. Actually do a crash course in visual physiology, if you like. So there are a few visual operations which are of the essence here. Of course, the first one being what's called feature detection, and that's one of the hallmarks. One of the building blocks of visual science, you may say. So that all these neurons in all these visual areas being tuned for basic features like orientation, which happens in these areas, V1, V2, V3, V4. Cells being tuned to the direction of motion, to depth or disparity rather, color, more complex shapes, etc., etc. So that's typically what you will find in all these visual areas, that they each extract particular features from the visual scene. And of course they typically also do this within a very localized receptive field. Although the receptive fields get larger the more forward you go into the visual hierarchy. But that's the core business, you could say, of what visual neurons are doing. Now, second to that is that we also have to realize that neurons often extract multiple features at the same time. Such as, for example, this example, a neuron which is orientation selective, only responding to when, these are the action potentials, only responding to when this bar which is going over the receptive field has this particular orientation. It's very orientation selective, as you can see. It's slightly off and it's already not responding all that strongly anymore. At the same time, it's also very direction selective. If the bar moves this way, it fires action potentials, but if it moves this way, it doesn't. So that's an example where you see that the conjunction, as it's called, of two features is actually encoded by this neuron. So orientation times direction of motion, which happens in regions like V1. This is a V1 cell, for example, but also areas like MT. But you also have cells which are encoding conjunctions of other features like shape and color. So a neuron is only responding when there is a particular shape, but also that shape then has to have a particular color. And of course, basically any neuron has this conjunction of feature and position, because they all have these restricted visual fields. So, of course, this neuron is tuned to this orientation, but only when this orientation is happening within this region of the visual field. So, yeah, they are sort of hardwired. These base groupings, as they're called, are also sort of hardwired into visual systems, in what visual neurons are doing. And this feature extraction also extends to higher level categorizations. So most famous example, of course, being that neurons are typically tuned to, in infratemporal lobe, that is, are typically tuned to faces, very selective to faces, maybe even particular faces. You have also neurons which are tuned to particular identities, like, you have these famous Bill Clinton cells and Darth Vader cells and what have you. Of course, there's this parahippocampal place area, which is sort of like tuned to things like places, but you have things like visual word form area, which is a region in the brain, which is typically responding to combinations of letters that form words, emotions, gist, well, all sorts of higher level categorizations that are also, of course, very important for recognizing objects, doing visual stuff, you could say. Another thing which is really important to understand, particularly if you want to understand aspects of like qualia and other consciousness stuff, is what's called perceptual interference, and a bit related to that, perceptual inference. It's sort of two sides of the same coin, I would say. Now, perceptual interference is that the features that neurons encode are not fully independent of each other. So this is, of course, a very well-known example. I mean, these are the exact same, well, I shouldn't actually say colors, but these are the exact same wavelengths coming from the screen. But depending on the context, of course, you perceive them as being entirely different. This brown and this one orange. Same with these. These are the exact same grays if you just would, if you would isolate them. These are fairly well-known examples, I suppose you know them. But of course they look fairly different. This is more like, in the context of shape, this looks bigger than this one, although they are actually the same. And this actually is vertical, although it looks a bit tilted to the left. And of course there are countless visual illusions which also show the same thing, which is that how we perceive things is not necessarily how, what the physical information, like the wavelength or the orientation itself or the grayscale or the size, would dictate. Because it's these kinds of things in perception are changed by, how the context of these physical features. And that relates a lot to what we call perceptual inference. That information that is inferred from the visual input goes beyond what is physically there. Actually, all these things about illusory contours, ambiguous stimuli, many other illusions, actually also the ones I just showed you. This is the famous Canissa triangle. Of course, you infer that this is a triangle overlying three circles. Well, of course, in fact, it's just three Pac-Man shapes looking at each other. And you even infer that this region of space has a bit more brightness than the background. Of course, you see these illusory contours. It's actually very difficult not to see a line going there, which is of course not there. So these two sides of that same coin, perceptual interference, perceptual inference, really tell you how at some point in the visual system things go beyond what's physically out there. Now and then, of course, there is this phenomenon of grouping, in Gestalt grouping to begin with, and the binding of and grouping of distant features and elements. So separate elements not only influence each other, as I've just showed you with the interference and inference, but separate elements also combine at some point to form coherent elements, coherent groups, you could say, bind together. For example, these line segments, so these five here sort of seem to group together as, a single line, and same here, these Gabor patches seem to group together as a single circle. And of course, this highly follows what I call Gestalt rules of perceptual organization. If you want to know more about that, there's other lectures about that. The main point being here is that there's no really specific and dedicated systems, or I should rather say no dedicated neurons which are doing this. So there's no neuron which is specifically tuned to a set of Gabor patches that are going in a circle, nor are there specific neurons that are tuned to five vertical lines lying in a row. But this is way more mediated by short and long range horizontal interactions between neurons which are tuned to this, for example, the same orientation. We know that in primary visual cortex, you have these neurons, which are of course each responding to within the receptive field. So once such a receptive field is shown there, each neuron will respond to this vertical orientation, of course, if it's tuned to vertical orientation. And these neurons are then connected via horizontal connections within primary visual cortex to sort of enable this grouping to happen. And the same thing here. And so this binding and grouping of distant features and elements is very much depending on horizontal interactions. And then, of course, there's this whole higher level perceptual organization, like the figure ground organizations I showed you. Of course, in the end, this is what vision is all about, combining all the different features, all the different elements in the scene into some sort of coherent interpretation of what's visually out there. And there's different names and different ways to look at it. One of them, I think, very influential, but also very interesting ways to look at it is what David Marr and Ken Nakayama call the 2.5D sketch. So that's sort of the level of vision where it sort of all comes together. It's called 2.5D because it's not fully 3D in the sense that vision is, of course, in the essence sort of flat, but of course also it's not. Well, anyhow, but of course what I also talked about when I also talked about things like figure ground organization and the interaction of all these Gestalt laws. I mean, this is what we call perceptual organization, making sense of a figure like this, but also making sense of something like this where you can see a Dalmatian dog. Although, of course, in the end, it's all like black and white patches of ink. So if we map these visual functions on different neural processes, which has been done, I mean, in that sense, visual science is way more advanced than any other sensory system we know. If we map these visual functions on neural processes, well, what you typically see is that this categorization, feature detection, but also these base groupings and also high-level feature detection and categorization is typically done something that's done in the feed-forward sweep. And so you have all these different neurons doing all their different things. Basically, at the very first moment that they receive information via these feed-forward connections, they know whether there's a face or not. They know whether there is an orientation with a particular motion. They know whether there's a particular color or shape in the visual field. So this is a very hardwired feed-forward sweep kind of thing. And then these incremental Gestalt groupings, I already talked about how this is depending on horizontal interactions, and these long-range and more complex organizations, of course, also depend on these horizontal interactions, but also very critically, as I've shown, on these recurrent interactions, feedback interactions from higher levels going back to lower levels. And this recurrent processing, as it's called, where all these different neurons interact, all these different neurons doing these feature detections and categorizations interact to make sense of the visual world. That's typically what recurrent processing, meaning horizontal and feedback processing, is giving you. Now these two things, the features interfering and things like color constancy and the perceptual inference and illusory contours and stuff, yeah, that's sort of a mixed bag. It depends a bit on exactly what kind of experiment you're looking at. Some of these may be implemented by feed-forward connections. Some of these may require horizontal feedback connections, depend a bit. So there's sort of a middle ground. That's why you have these gray thingies here. But this is more or less what we know about how vision works, you could say. And then, of course, critical questions remaining now are how do these visual processes then depend on, well, for one thing, attention and access and report, but of course then also on the conscious state or on conscious perception. Well, as we've already seen, recurrent processing depends on the conscious state and reflects conscious content, while feed-forward processing is independent of these. Recurrent processing is absent when stimuli are not seen. I showed you this experiment with the quasi-blindside paradigm. It's absent when stimuli are masked. Showed you that. It's absent during anesthesia. So all these things pointing to, well, of course, feed-forward processing is still intact. So yeah, all these findings, to just go over them quickly and summarize them. Any manipulation of visibility, like masking, anesthesia, etc., suggests a distinction between conscious and unconscious visual functions, being that the unconscious visual functions typically are these low-level feature extractions, the high-level feature extractions, the base groupings, maybe perceptual inference constancy mechanisms. As I said, these are sort of middle ground. But definitely the Gestalt grouping and perceptual organization, which depends on these recurrent interactions, is not happening during unconscious states. It's only happening in conscious states. Now, of course, we have to realize that what I'm talking about here are what are called visibility manipulations, so things which really render stuff invisible. Like anesthesia, well, yeah, that's sort of knocking out consciousness completely, of course, if all is well. But, you know, like things like in blindsight, but for example, also masking and dichoptic masking, and these objective, maybe even subjective thresholds. These are all things which, yeah, make things invisible in the sense that even if you sit there and want to see what else there, so you're sitting in front of a monitor and the stimulus presented, but it's sufficiently masked, or it's in dichoptic masking or any other manipulation, successful manipulation of visibility, it's just impossible for you to know what's out there. It's impossible to see. It's not, and of course in that sense that's very different from these attentional manipulations like attentional blink, but also the change blindness, the inattentional blindness. It's not that it's impossible to see what's going on in change blindness or what's going on in inattentional blindness or even in neglect. You know, if you point the patients to the thing that they're not attending, they will see it. So that's already from the get-go, of course, a very different manipulation than these. I mean, this is just diverting your attention so that you don't notice them, but that's of course a very different manipulation than these, and making things really invisible. And if we look at these kinds of manipulations, the attentional manipulations, and then look at to what extent they interfere with these perceptual processes. For example, this is actually quite cute experiment where they this is one of my former co-workers, where we looked at kinesia illusion specific neural signals. So that we looked at to what extent or how such a kinesia figure is represented in visual cortex. And of course, yeah, this is very much depending on perceptual inference, this is a prime example of what's called perceptual inference. And then compared signals in visual cortex to these control stimuli. This is of course with the classic control with the Pac-Man inverted. This is with the this is something where you also have these sort of quasi Pac-Man, either forming a pentagon shape or not. And of course the critical difference between this one and this one is that in this one you really have this induced percept, that you infer this pentagon lying on top of circles and stuff, which is not really happening with this control. So this is actually quite a good control for the you could say the pure kinesia phenomenon. As you can see, the kinesia stimulus typically evokes stronger activation in all these typical fairly low-level visual areas. Then this is compared to a situation where subjects were not attending to these stimuli, but had to attend to some letters which were presented in the center of the screen. And then if asked afterwards whether they actually, just like with the gorilla experiments, were asked afterwards, well, did you actually notice that there were some of these kinesia figures every now and then? Of course, you know, these were all mixed. Of course, they would say, yeah, I saw these things in the surround, but never really realized that they were forming these kinds of things. But regardless of this prolonged inattention, as it's called, you still get these this neural signature, you could say, of the kinesia figures being there. Could even argue it's even a bit stronger. But the point being that these this perceptual inference mechanisms work in visual cortex regardless of whether you attend to these stimuli or not. And in this experiment, they actually combined these two manipulations of consciousness, you could say, the visibility manipulation by masking and the attentional manipulation by using an attentional blink in a single experiment, so as to really get at, you know, how these in this case, perceptual inference mechanisms depend on these two different ways of, well, manipulating whether people say, I saw this or not. Two different types of trials. One, of course, there was this so-called T1, so the first target that people had to detect, which, well, in this case would be any kind of black Pac-Man kind of thing, being present among all these red ones. And then this one was followed by some randomly organized Pac-Man, but these were with low contrast mask, so the thing is still clearly visible, but of course you have to pay some attention to see this. And then let's go to this one first. And then when this is followed within a short lag of, say, 300 milliseconds by a second stimulus, the T2, a second target, I should actually say, which is also followed by low contrast mask, so which is in principle clearly visible, your subject will suffer from the attentional blink and not being able to detect this one because they were still engaged in detecting this one. And it's typical attentional blink phenomenon. Of course, an attentional manipulation. It's not that this is invisible. If they would not have to detect the first one, of course, they would easily be able to detect this one. And that's then different from the masking situation where there's no attentional blink because there's a long lag, but there is strong mask because the second target is followed by high contrast mask, which makes this thing not sort of invisible to see, even though your attention is focused on it because you don't suffer from the attentional blink anymore from the T1 because there's this long lag. And then they recorded EEG to see to what extent the perceptual inference mechanisms were still working under these two conditions. Now, of course, mind you, in both conditions, in the end, people say, no, I didn't see T2. Of course, in this case, because it was masked, and in this case, because it was attentionally blinked. But the end result, from the point of view of a report, is of course exactly the same. People say, no, I didn't see this. Now they looked at different contrasts in the EEG signals. For one thing, the low-level feature contrast, like this is where the luminance contrast is fairly low, and this is where the luminance contrast is higher. So this is of course a very low-level visual feature. So they wanted to see whether you could extract that information from the EEG signals. But of course, the important one was the perceptual integration. This is, of course, with low perceptual integration, and this is with high perceptual integration, because, of course, here is they call it perceptual integration. You could also call it perceptual inference, or, of course, these are pentagons are sort of a combination of integration and inference, but anyhow, high-level visual processes, which are, of course, going on with the Canisse illusion configuration, but not with these other configurations, the contrast configurations. And if you then look at at what point in time you can decode from the EEG signals these different contrasts, so the luminance contrast or the integration inference contrast, what you will typically see is that the low-level contrast you can decode somewhere maximally at 92 milliseconds, which makes sense, of course, because that's a very feed-forward simple feature. This graph, whereas the perceptual integration contrast you can more strongly decode at a latency of something like 250 milliseconds, 56 to be precise, which also makes sense because this typically requires recurrent interactions and more prolonged processing in visual cortex. Now, of course, the key question is how do these two signals then depend on attentional blink or masking? And that's what you have here. In the case of masking, you still can decode the feed-forward luminance contrast signal, which is now maximized at 82, so sort of in the same range. But there's really no perceptual integration signal to be decoded anymore from the EEG signals. Whereas in the unmasked yet attentional blink situation, so that's this one, in the attentional blink situation, with the long lag, you get the you can decode the perceptual integration, but with the short lag, so when there really is attentional blink, you can still decode the perceptual integration. Whereas in the mask, of course, you cannot do that with either long or short lags. So bottom line, feature detection, like the contrast thing, is still happening with masking and with attentional blink, But the perceptual integration is not happening with masking, but still happening during attentional blink. And so, well, for one thing, of course, that shows you that these two manipulations, the visibility manipulation and the attentional manipulation, although in the end, both resulting in subjects saying, no, I didn't see this, and that fact is then caused, subjects saying, I don't see it, for totally different reasons. In the one case, of course, because the stimulus is really invisible and not even processed in visual cortex in the case of masking. In the other case, the attentional blink situation, because, well, stuff is still processed in visual cortex up to the point of this high-level perceptual integration inference mechanisms. But because of the attention, people cannot, well, you could say memorize or detect or transfer it into access, and hence, therefore, report not seeing it. So if we summarize all these kinds of findings, that's what I've tried to do in this table. What you will have, if you look at these different visual functions, you will have the feature extraction and categorization, the typical feed-forward stuff. Well, that's basically always happening. I mean, whether things are fully invisible, like in masking, or even in subjective invisibility, of course, also when it's unattended, and of course, when it's visible, yeah, well, then of course it's also happening. But these things sort of always happen. I mean, I already showed you as well that they even happen during anesthesia. So you sort of have to be, I don't know, dead to not have this happening in your visual brain. And that's very different from the perceptual organization kind of things, which don't happen under conditions of invisibility, like with masking, and also not when things are subjectively invisible, but still happen in cases of inattention. When it's visible yet unattended, it's happening just as well as when it's visible yet attended. And again, the interference and inference results are typically somewhere in between a bit, but fall more into the category of not depending that much on attention, as we've just seen in the experiment that I just showed you. But there are other experiments where it's a bit more on the fence. But anyhow, so that tells you, as I said, a really important point, which is that subjects saying, no, I didn't see this, may happen for entirely different reasons. The one being, things not happening in visual cortex, the integration processes, the higher level visual functions like integration, inference, perceptual organization, not happening in visual cortex, which is typically what happens with masking, anesthesia, etc. Or all those things still going on in visual cortex, but subjects saying no because of a lack of attention and access, and then hence reportability. And attention not being able to, disrupt higher level visual processes like perceptual inference and integration and perceptual organization, of course also fits very nicely with the phenomenon that conscious visual perception is typically what's called cognitively impenetrable. Now what's that? For example, if I show you these visual illusions, so this looking orange and this looking brown, or that this is not really there, but the Canista illusion, or these two being the exact same grays. I mean, me telling you that doesn't change one bit on what you perceive. And so even if you know, because I told you that these are, these two things are emitting the exact same wavelengths, even on your monitor, and these are also emitting the exact same amount of light, it's still impossible for you to not see this as lighter than this one, or not seeing this as orange and this is brown, or not seeing this as a Canista triangle. So knowing about these visual illusions cannot make you unsee them, which is what the concept of cognitive impenetrability actually means. So cognition cannot interfere with conscious visual perception. Conscious visual perception does its own thing, regardless of what you think of it. Of course, we know that cognition and attention can sort of modulate your visual percepts. So of course, attention increases level of processing and stuff like that. So responses typically get a bit larger. So in that sense, may modulate your visual percepts. And for example, if you really focus your attention on, say, one of these Pac-Man, it's may become sort of difficult to see the Canista triangle. So there's slightly modulations that we know that of cognition and attention. But in the essence, visual perception is enclosed, is a thing which is not accessible by recognition. And of course, that's very much in line with all these attentional manipulations, not being able to disrupt the visual processes, not even the higher level visual processes like inference, perceptual organization, and what have you. So summarizing this, we have these feed-forward activations, which are giving cells the receptive field properties, and for example, are expressed in EEG potentials like P1 and stuff like that, which is doing feature extraction, categorization, also high-level categorization. And then we have this visual recurrent processing, which is expressed, for example, by the contextual modulation results I showed you. Other researchers have shown this to be related to what's called the N200, so a negative going EEG potential at 200 milliseconds. Visual awareness negativity, those fall more or less in the same category of being neural markers of what's called these recurrent interactions between all these visual regions, which are giving you the perceptual organization and stuff like that. And then, of course, we have the frontal parietal activation, the global workspace ignition, the P3B, which is, giving you higher level cognitive processes like attention, access, and report. But in the essence, giving you the fact that you know what's going on there in the visual cortex. But of course, that's something else than the mere seeing. And so if you want to take conscious discussions all out of the equation, you could also say very simply, well, this is invisible, this is what we call visible, and this is what we call attended and reported. But of course, that's sort of dodging the bullet where the magic happens, you could say. I would say if you really want to explain phenomenology, so why visual perception looks the way it looks, so why we see kinetic triangles, why we see colors, why we have maybe even qualia and stuff, you could say, well, this is sort of the transition where that magic happens, where phenomenology gets explained, and this is all, well, you could say post perceptual. Because all of this happens regardless of attention and access and report. That's why recurrent processing argues this is unconscious, this is where consciousness happens, and this is, where post-perceptual both access and report actually happens. So from you could say functionalist perspective, you could say, conscious visual experience arises with perceptual organization, with the binding, with the grouping, with the integration. And that's a different way of looking at this. So regardless of how it's implemented in the brain, you could say conscious visual experience is perceptual organization. And of course, the more physicalist conclusion will be, conscious visual experience arises with the transition from feed-forward to recurrent visual processing. Now, why exactly that would be the case is, of course, a different matter. I mean, feed-forward and recurrent processing, in the end, it's all neurons doing action potentials. So, why would there be something magical with recurrent processing as opposed to feed-forward processing? That's, of course, a question you could ask. Maybe it just happens to be the case that these recurrent interactions enable perceptual organization and hence give you the conscious experience. But there could also be more fundamental reasons. One of them being that recurrent interactions and feed-forward interactions actually use different neurotransmitter systems. And that's something that actually has been shown by colleagues from the Brain Institute, Matthew Self and Peter Rossema, by recording from neurons in primary visual cortex, while also injecting drugs that either selectively block NMDA receptors or AMPA receptors. And what they observed, was the following. If you block the NMDA receptors by injecting APV, you more strongly interfere with the recurrent interactions and not so much with the feed-forward signals. This is, again, recurrent signals evoked by these figure ground stimuli that I showed you a lot already. As you can see, there's some interference with feed-forward sweep, but there's way stronger interference with recurrent processing signals. Well, the opposite happens if you block the AMPA receptor with CNQX, which is just a drug which does that. yeah, as you can see, there's a very strong interference with the feed-forward sweep activation. You can also see that here, but not so much with the recurrent signals, indicating, well, for one thing, that there is also a somewhat more fundamental difference between feed-forward and recurrent processing, which may also, well, have something to do with why the one and the other is more related to consciousness. Of course, for one thing, it would explain why recurrent signals are more susceptible to anesthesia. Maybe anesthesia is more targeting NMDA type receptors than AMPA receptors, for which there is actually also some evidence. But of course, maybe at a more fundamental level, it could maybe also explain why consciousness is more depending on recurrent processing, because NMDA receptors, of course, we know, are very much linked to learning. So neuroplasticity, the fact that you can change the connections between neurons, is of course the essence of memory and learning. And maybe, of course, this is sort of hand waving, maybe kind of argumentation, but maybe it's the case that, you know, consciousness is also there for us to be able to learn something from visual information. And so whenever we receive visual information and it engages in recurrent interactions and activates these NMDA receptors, our brain slightly changes, you could say. It learns from the environment. And then this happens to go along with having a conscious experience. Of course, that's not totally explaining why conscious experiences arise from these recurrent interactions, but it could be sort of a window into, I don't know, solving this mystery maybe. Another thing that recurrent processing theory obviously would argue for is that in this whole discussion of change blindness, inattentional blindness, etc., you actually have a conscious percept of stuff that is represented in visual cortex. So this large capacity representation that you seem to have, according to these fragile memory, iconic memory experiments, which is sitting in the back of the head, recurrent processing theory actually regards as, well, a remnant of your conscious perception at the moment you saw them. So although easily overwritten, but yeah, having a large capacity. Whereas this smaller capacity, stable representation sitting in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, requiring attention, is something which, you know, is a post-perceptual phenomenon, or of course it's memory again, so a remnant of the more post-perceptual stuff. And in that sense, it's arguing for what is called perception overflowing access and reportability. Now, what does overflowing mean? Well, it simply means that whenever you look at a stimulus like this, you actually do see all of these 8 objects, but that amount of information, you could say, is way too much for your cognitive systems and your attentional systems to handle. So if you want to memorize these, or if you want to report about these, or if you want to cognitively reflect on these, you know, internally discuss with yourself, maybe not even verbally, but you know what a bread of loaf is for, or what a pear is for, or how a pear grows. All these cognitive associations that come along with these visual items. Yeah, that requires, of course, these more frontal functions, and you cannot do that for all these items at the same time. And so in that sense, your visual perception is overflowing access and reportability. But of course, it then would argue that indeed vision is in fact rich, yet has limited memory. And so you do see these 8 objects, but they also get overwritten with every new scene. In that sense, they're very fragile. So recurrent processing theory argues that change blindness actually should not be called change blindness. It's more like change lack of access or something, because it happens in the domain of access, not in the visual domain. So indeed, you did see these 2 guys when they're standing behind this desk, and the one is ducking behind it, and then you see the next one coming up. Yeah, at the moment you saw them, but you know, once the first one is gone, you forget about him and then look at the second one. And also your scenes are not reduced to gist I mean, that happens in access, but not in vision itself. Now, of course, one of the counter arguments that have been made is, yeah, that's all very nice, but you know what good does it do to have fleeting visual percepts that are very fragile, not even memorized, that you kind of report about? Why should we even call these conscious and not simply call them pre-conscious, and then only call the final stage when stuff is attended and access really conscious? Because this is Stanislas Dehaene, who was one of the main proponents of this global workspace theory, one of the main proponents of this taxonomy, where we call this level pre-conscious and this level conscious. Well, I would say, to counter that argument, this is me, by the way, because taxonomy actually matters. You know, if you want to explain, well, you could say where the magic happens. If we want to sort of get a handle on why phenomenality looks the way, why conscious experiences look the way they look, and what really is the boundary between conscious and unconscious, we have to put it in the right place, which I think is between levels 1 and 2, and not between, you know, between these two, and not between these two. And this actually hinges into a very important discussion that we will go into in the next section as well, which is, you know, which of these transitions do the explaining when it comes to solving this riddle of visual experience. So why are we different from photo cameras? Why am I, when I drive my car, why is that different from when my car drives itself? Is that because of the cognition, or is that because of, you know, this transition? That's, of course, I mean, if we want to address these kinds of questions, we really have to put the transition at the right place, and also at that place which goes, well, which does the best job at explaining the visual experience. Because, yeah, then only, of course, in that way we do justice to this whole search for neurocorrelates of consciousness. And yeah, do we do justice to what explaining and understanding what consciousness actually is or does? And as already said, of course, doing it this way also gives consciousness its own independent ontological status. I mean, in the sense that it's orthogonal to cognition and attention. Whereas, of course, otherwise we usually conflate, if we only call this conscious, we usually conflate consciousness with attention and cognition. And then you might argue, well, why call it consciousness at all, or in the first place? Why not just call this attention? And of course, there are these theories which position attention very much at the center of explaining consciousness. I mean, global workspace theory is one of them, but then there's also other theories like attention schemata theory and related ones, which actually do that. But I think then you are sort of conflating the two issues. So I think it's a mistake. The mistake that was made in interpreting change-blindness experiments is that it's a failure of attention and a failure of working memory and of access and report. And this was then mistaken for a failure of conscious visual perception itself. So in fact, you did have a rich and detailed, precise and phenomenal and hence conscious visual percept at the moment you looked at them. And then it was lost because, you know, the guy went behind the counter. So it wasn't a failure of conscious perception. And indeed, if you would, as I say, if you would have asked your brain at the moment you looked at these guys, you would have seen these recurrent interactions between fusiform face area and visual cortex and all the other neural signals, such as, by the way, the NMDA receptor activation, that mark this transition between unconscious and conscious processing. And we would have seen integrated neural activity. So that's sort of I'm glad the guy gets it. That's sort of the summary here of, you know, what recurrent processing theory is trying to achieve. So not conflate cognition with consciousness, because, you know, probing into the details of change blindness shows you that indeed conscious perception is overflowing cognition. And most importantly, that these neural signatures of conscious vision, like the recurrent processing and hence perceptual organization, indeed explain the properties of conscious vision. And yeah, I think it's a sort of a misleading taxonomy to call that pre-conscious, because it makes us bark up the wrong tree when it comes to really understanding consciousness. So summary. But anyhow, so I think this is sort of at the core of arguing why we may indeed have conscious experience that we cannot remember, that we cannot report about, which intuitively, of course, flies in the face of my own introspection being the gold standard of what conscious experiences actually are. Because, of course, this introspection also depends on attention and inner speech and cognition and memory. But seeing is just way more simpler than that. Maybe this is also because my background is a vision scientist, and of course we know a great deal about vision already. Of course, there are bits and pieces missing there, but visual processing and how vision works really does all the explaining that needs to be done when it comes to understanding why conscious visual percepts look the way they look, and why, for example, when we see color, we don't see wavelength. And that's the phenomenon of color constancy, of course, tells us that, for example, when we look at something in the morning light or in the evening light, there's very different wavelengths coming from that visual scene. But regardless, we see the same colors in the sense that we see the same banana being yellow or brown if it's a bit overripe. And that's of course what color vision is actually about, what color vision is actually for, so that we can judge the properties of, well, fruit, for example, regardless of the light that's shining on them. And that's typically something that happens in conscious vision. And well, these recurrent interactions and how color constancy works in the visual brain goes a long way in explaining, how that comes about, how we go from wavelength to color, for example. And one of the objections I have against these higher order theories, higher order thought theory, global workspace theory, is that attending stuff or having access to stuff or stuff being reportable does very little actually towards explaining why we go from wavelength to color. Actually, there's no explanatory power there at all. And so that's why I would say this would favor these, well, you could say more back in the head theories of consciousness over these more frontal theories of consciousness. Now, there's one other theory of consciousness which sort of does the same thing. Well, for one thing, allocates consciousness more in the back of the head than in the front of the head, but also tries to follow the same agenda, which is how can we actually explain why consciousness is the way it is? And that's integrated information theory, which has similarities with recurrent processing theory, but also goes a bit further. So let's discuss that next.